In the year 1939, Great Britain stood unrivaled, commanding the single largest empire in human history, stretching across a quarter of the globe's entire landmass. This colossal dominion ruled over a staggering quarter of the world's population, projecting unshakable authority from the bustling streets of London to the furthest corners of Asia. The British pound sterling reigned supreme as the world's reserve currency, facilitating global trade and signaling the unmatched economic stability of the British crown. Dominating every major ocean, the Royal Navy projected immense military force, ensuring that British interests were protected and its merchant fleets could navigate safely everywhere. Britain was the undisputed global superpower, a titan of industry and commerce that seemed destined to rule the geopolitical landscape for centuries to come. Yet merely 17 years later, in 1956, this titan was reduced to begging the United States for permission to protect its own vital strategic interests. The rapid decline continued until 1967, when the once mighty pound sterling collapsed, shattering international confidence in Britain's ability to manage its own economic affairs. By 1976, the humiliation was complete, as Britain stood hat in hand, requesting a desperate financial bailout from the International Monetary Fund to survive. The empire that had dictated global terms for 2 centuries transformed into a secondary European power in just 3 turbulent and devastating decades. Standard history textbooks often claim Britain lost its empire due to rising independence, movements, moral progress, and a voluntary end to colonialism. While political sentiments shifted, the brutal reality is that the British Empire did not end because of a moral awakening, but because of financial insolvency. Britain effectively went bankrupt, losing the economic war during World War II, even as it secured a military victory against the Axis powers. We must examine exactly how Britain bankrupted itself, and how the United States systematically replaced it as the dominant financial and military force. Understanding this collapse is crucial because the economic patterns that destroyed the British Empire are visibly emerging within the American economy today. The British Empire did not dissolve by choice. It dissolved because the treasury was empty and the mechanisms of power could no longer be funded. Following the First World War, the empire actually reached its territorial peak in 1920, covering nearly 14 million square miles of the Earth's surface. It governed over 450 million subjects with vast territories on every continent, truly becoming the empire on which the sun never set. However, the true foundation of British power was never just land or soldiers, it was the incredible financial leverage of the City of London. International trade was conducted almost exclusively in pounds, meaning foreign nations held British currency in their reserves, financing Britain's global ambitions. London served as the undisputed financial capital of the world, where British banks funded railroads, mines, and industrial projects across 6 different continents. This immense financial dominance meant Britain could borrow money at the absolute lowest interest rates globally, a privilege denied to lesser powers. Low borrowing costs allowed the government to fund its massive military machine cheaply and finance colonial administration primarily through debt. Britain effectively controlled the mechanisms of global trade because it held the keys to both the currency and the credit lines. The entire international economic system was built upon the gold standard, where the British pound was strictly backed by physical gold. This was not merely a theoretical value. It meant that every paper pound in circulation represented a specific fixed amount of precious metal. A person could walk into a bank and demand to exchange their paper notes for actual gold coins, ensuring absolute confidence in the currency. This convertibility made the pound incredibly trustworthy and was the primary reason it became the preferred reserve currency for the entire world. By this time, the United States economy had technically surpassed Britain's in size, but Britain's reach and influence remained vastly superior. For a small island nation of only 44 million people, its economic output was staggering, ranking second only to the emerging American giant. British industries were the engine of the world, with British coal steel textiles and heavy machinery powering development across the globe. Underpinning this economic engine was the Royal Navy, which remained the largest fleet on the planet, guaranteeing safe passage for British goods. In 1920, to the outside observer, Britain looked invincible, but deep within the financial system, fatal cracks were already beginning to fracture. The first devastating blow to this financial fortress was the First World War, a conflict of unprecedented scale and expense. From 1914 to 1918, the war effort cost Britain roughly £35 billion, a sum that drained the national treasury dry. While that number might seem manageable by modern standards relative to the size of the economy at the time, it was utterly catastrophic. To put this into proper perspective, Britain's entire gross domestic product in 1914 was only about £2.5 billion. The total cost of the war was 14 times larger than Britain's entire annual economic output, a burden no nation could sustain. To pay for this survival, Britain first turned to taxation, raising rates dramatically on its citizens to fund the war machine. Income tax, which had been practically non-existent for the average person before the war, skyrocketed to rates as high as 30%. Yet even these crushing taxes could not cover the immense costs of total war, forcing the government to look for other dangerous solutions. The second method was borrowing with the government, selling war bonds to its own citizens and urging them to invest in victory. Crucially, Britain also began borrowing massive sums from the United States, transforming itself from a creditor into a net debtor. By 1918, the national debt had exploded from a manageable $650 million to an eye-watering £7.4 billion. This represented an 11-fold increase in national debt in just 4 years, a financial hole that would take generations to fill. The third desperation method was selling assets, forcing Britain to liquidate its foreign investments to pay for immediate weapons and supplies. Before the war, Britain owned vast wealth overseas, but a huge chunk of that portfolio was sold off to finance the fighting. There was also a critical currency problem. In 1914, Britain left the gold standard to print money freely for the war effort. The pound, which had been as good as gold for centuries, was suddenly reduced to mere paper backed only by government promises. They attempted to return to the gold standard in 1925 at the old pre-war rate, but this decision proved to be a catastrophic mistake. The pound was now massively overvalued, which made British exports incredibly expensive and uncompetitive in the recovering global marketplace. This policy choked the British economy, causing severe deflation and persistently high unemployment throughout the entirety of the 1920s. The structural damage was done, but much of it remained hidden from public view behind the facade of imperial grandeur. Britain had quietly shifted from being the world's banker to a major debtor, while the United States had risen to become the new creditor. The global financial balance of power had fundamentally shifted across the Atlantic, but most of the world had not yet realized it. On the surface, Britain still appeared to rule the world, but financially, the empire was hanging on by a rapidly fraying thread. If World War I was expensive, the outbreak of World War II proved to be the final fatal blow to the empire's finances. The Second World War cost Britain another £28 billion, a figure that obliterated what little economic resilience remained. While the absolute number was lower than the First War relative to the now shattered economy, the burden was impossible to bear. Britain fought World War II through total mobilization, dedicating every scrap of national energy to the defeat of fascism. At the peak of the war, an incredible 55% of the entire country's GDP was dedicated solely to military spending. The British economy was devoted entirely to the war effort, meaning food, fuel, and clothing were strictly rationed for every citizen. Every single national resource was directed toward one goal, survival, but this burned through the nation's remaining wealth at an unprecedented rate. By 1941, Britain was financially exhausted and on the absolute verge of total economic collapse, unable to pay for imported food. It was at this desperate moment that the United States stepped in with the Lend-Lease program, offering a lifeline to the drowning empire. However, this assistance was not charity. The United States charged interest and demanded repayment, treating the war as a business transaction. In exchange for these supplies, Britain was forced to agree to American terms, which included dismantling its system of imperial trade preferences. The U.S. demanded that the British Empire open its protected markets to American trade and investment, effectively ending Britain's economic monopoly. Furthermore, Britain had to accept American financial oversight, signaling a profound loss of sovereignty in exchange for the weapons of war. In essence, Britain was forced to trade the long-term viability of its empire for the short-term survival of its home islands. The United States was effectively purchasing global dominance at a discount, using Britain's desperation to secure its own future market access. The immediate result was a debt explosion of biblical proportions that would shackle the British economy for decades to come. By the end of the war, in 1945, Britain's national debt had reached a staggering 250% of its GDP. To understand the scale, that debt burden was 2.5 times larger than the entire value of the British economy. For comparison, the United States' debt today is around 123%, and Greece peaked at 180%. Britain in 1945 was in a league of its own, facing a financial hole so deep that recovery seemed mathematically impossible. To service the interest on this debt, Britain had to sell everything of value that wasn't bolted to the floor. Remaining foreign investments were liquidated, and British holdings in foreign railways and utilities were sold off to pay creditors. The nation's gold reserves were completely depleted, shipped across the Atlantic to pay for munitions and essential food supplies. Even art treasures and overseas real estate holdings were sold, stripping the nation of the accumulated wealth of the Victorian age. By 1945, Britain had completed its transformation from the world's wealthy banker to the world's desperate beggar dependent on foreign charity. It took only 30 years and 2 world wars to completely dismantle centuries of British financial accumulation and dominance. Britain was now entirely dependent on the United States, owing over $4.3 billion in fresh loans just to survive. While 4 billion might sound small today in 1945, it was a crushing burden on an economy that lay in ruins. Britain relied on these American loans for the most basic necessities, including the wheat required to make bread for its people. While the war was still raging, the Allies met at Bretton Woods to design the architecture of the post-war financial world. Britain was represented by the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes, who proposed a neutral international currency to facilitate fair trade. But the United States, represented by Harry Dexter White, had a different plan. They wanted the US dollar to be king. The US insisted that the dollar become the new global reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 an ounce. Britain, bankrupt and desperate for American aid, was in absolutely no position to argue against the American demands. The United States held all the financial cards, and they played them ruthlessly to secure their economic hegemony. Consequently, the US dollar officially replaced the British pound as the foundation of the global economic system. This was not merely a technical change of currency, it was the single most important transfer of power in the 20th century. Being the reserve currency means that every nation on Earth needs your money to conduct international trade. It creates a constant built-in global demand for your currency, allowing you to print money without immediate hyperinflation. It means the issuer can run huge trade deficits indefinitely because the rest of the world is willing to hold its debt. The dominant nation can borrow at the lowest rates, and its domestic financial sector inevitably becomes the world's clearinghouse. For 200 years, Britain had enjoyed these incredible, exorbitant privileges, using them to fund its empire and lifestyle. Overnight, these advantages were stripped from London and handed to Washington, cementing the American century. The crisis for the British pound began immediately as the markets realized the fundamental shift in power had occurred. Britain tried to maintain the pound's value, but without the underlying economic strength, it was fighting a losing battle against reality. Britain was still running massive trade deficits, consuming far more than it produced, but the dollar was now the king. The pound sterling was massively overvalued, and international markets knew that Britain did not have the reserves to support it. However, to admit this weakness was to admit that Britain was no longer a great power, so the politicians delayed the inevitable. The first major humiliation came in 1949 when market pressure forced Britain to devalue the pound by 30%. The value dropped from $4.03 to $2.80, a shocking admission of national decline. Great powers do not devalue their currencies. They dictate terms to others. Yet, Britain was now at the mercy of the markets. Even this drastic measure didn't solve the core problem. Britain simply could no longer afford the overhead of its empire. Maintaining an empire required military garrisons across the globe and naval presence, every ocean, and vast colonial administrations. Britain's economy was now half the size of America's, yet it was trying to maintain a global footprint that the math couldn't support. The breaking point, the moment the world saw the emperor had no clothes, was the Suez Crisis of 1956. Egypt's leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital artery for shipping oil to Britain and Europe. Britain, which owned 44% of the canal company, was outraged and refused to let this challenge to its authority stand. In a secret pact with France and Israel, they launched a military operation to retake the canal and topple Nasser. Militarily, the operation was a success. Within days, British and French forces had occupied the strategic canal zone. But then the United States stepped in, and President Eisenhower was absolutely furious at the deception by his allies. He opposed the operation and threatened to bring Britain to its knees, not with bombs or bullets, but with finance. The US threatened strict economic sanctions and to cut off vital oil supplies that Britain needed to function. Most critically, the US threatened to sell its vast holdings of British pounds, which would have crashed the currency instantly. America also blocked the emergency loans Britain desperately needed from the International Monetary Fund to stabilize its reserves. It was financial blackmail on a global scale, and Britain's foreign reserves began draining away at a terrifying speed. The United States delivered a clear and cold ultimatum: withdraw from the Suez immediately or face total financial ruin. Britain had no choice. Despite their military victory on the ground, they were forced to withdraw in complete humiliation. The Suez Crisis ruthlessly revealed the new world order British military power meant nothing without American financial approval. The empire was exposed as a facade, and it was now undeniably clear that the United States was pulling the strings. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace, his health and reputation shattered by the confrontation with American power. Following Suez, the pound came under renewed attack, and independence movements across the empire smelled blood in the water. They saw that Britain was weak and could no longer enforce its will, accelerating the push for freedom across Africa and Asia. Suez didn't cause the end of the empire, but it made its end undeniable, irreversible, and surprisingly rapid. The decline continued into the 60s. In 1967, Britain was forced to devalue the pound again, another 14% cut. Prime Minister Harold Wilson went on television and famously lied, telling the people that the pound in your pocket hadn't lost value. It was a desperate attempt to save face, but everyone knew that Britain was stuck in a cycle of decline. Why did this keep happening? Because Britain was consuming more than it produced, running trade deficit after trade deficit. When you have the reserve currency, you can get away with this, but Britain didn't have that privilege anymore. It had to pay for its imports with foreign currency, and it was constantly running out of dollars and gold. The Bank of England would try to defend the pound by selling reserves and jacking up interest rates, but it was futile. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Britain became known as the sick man of Europe, crippled by a stagnant economy. Stagflation took hold, combining high inflation with low growth, while strikes paralyzed major industries for weeks at a time. The energy crisis made everything worse, causing manufacturing to collapse and triggering a massive brain drain to America. The nation that had been the wealthiest on Earth just 50 years prior was now in a state of managed decline. The ultimate humiliation came in 1976, when Britain faced yet another currency collapse and had nowhere left to turn. The IMF agreed to the bailout, but they imposed harsh conditions, cut government spending, raise interest rates, and implement severe austerity. The nation that once ruled a quarter of the world was now taking strict orders from a group of international bureaucrats. During this period of financial strangulation, Britain rapidly liquidated its empire, unable to afford the cost of global governance. The jewel in the crown, India and Pakistan, was let go in 1947, signaling the beginning of the end. Malaysia followed in 1957, and the vast majority of Britain's African colonies gained independence throughout the turbulent 60s. This massive retreat continued until the last major possession, Hong Kong, was handed back to China in 1997. The official history books tell a story of moral enlightenment of a benevolent empire gracefully granting independence to its subjects. While political movements were real, the brutal underlying reality was that Britain was simply bankrupt and could not pay the bills. Every single colony had become a drain on the treasury, requiring military protection and infrastructure investment that Britain did not have. The empire had to go not because of a sudden change of heart, but because the money had completely run out. So what is the lesson here? Britain's collapse followed a clear, undeniable mathematical pattern that we can analyze. Step 1 is the accumulation of massive national debt, usually triggered by fighting expensive wars that drain the treasury. Step 2 is the loss of reserve currency status, stripping the nation of the economic privilege to print money without consequence. Step 3 is the habit of persistent trade deficits, a chronic condition of consuming far more wealth than the nation produces. Step 4 is repeated currency devaluations, destroying the purchasing power of the people to keep the system afloat. Step 5 is becoming dependent on foreign creditors, losing sovereignty to those who hold your national debt. And finally, step 6 is the loss of political independence and the forced liquidation of national and imperial assets. Now, we must turn our eyes to the United States today and ask where it stands on this trajectory of decline. First, debt accumulation. The U.S. national debt is currently at $35 trillion and counting, driven by endless wars and spending. Second, the decline of the dollar's reserve status. While still dominant, it is slowly being eroded by competing global blocs. Third, persistent trade deficits. Check. The U.S. has been consuming more than it produces for decades, relying on cheap imports. Fourth, currency pressure. Since 1971, the U.S. dollar has lost over 86% of its purchasing power. Fifth, rising debt costs. Interest payments on the national debt now officially exceed the entire national defense budget. This is a critical threshold, signifying that the past is now more expensive to maintain than the safety of the future. Growing constraints on our actions are already visible, with geopolitical rivals sensing the weakness in the financial foundation. The final stage for Britain was empire liquidation, the selling off of assets, and the retreat from global power. The terrifying question for America today is simply this. In the modern context, what exactly do we liquidate? We do not have colonies to grant independence to. Our empire is one of bases, alliances, and financial influence. The critical difference between the British collapse and the potential American one is the speed of the unraveling. It took Britain about 30 agonizing years to go from the dominant global empire to an IMF bailout case. In today's hyper-fast, interconnected digital financial world, markets move at the speed of light, not the speed of telegraphs. What took Britain 3 decades could theoretically happen to America in half that time if the current trajectory continues. The warning from history is stark and unforgiving. No empire is immune to the laws of mathematics and finance. Britain didn't choose to end its empire. It was forced to by the cold, hard reality of financial insolvency. Empires do not end because of moral progress or political enlightenment. They end because they go broke. Financial power is the only real power. Without it, armies are just expensive parades and influence is just talk. Military strength is meaningless if you cannot afford to sustain it, fuel it, and pay the soldiers who wield it. Having the world's reserve currency is the ultimate superpower, a privilege that must be protected at all costs. Britain learned this lesson the hard way, losing its status and its power in a single generation of mismanagement. America may be next in line, walking the exact same path step by step towards a potential financial Suez moment. The parallels are not just similar, they are nearly identical, flashing red warnings to anyone willing to look at the data. Just like Britain, we have normalized the idea that we can spend money we do not have forever. Just like Britain, we assume our military dominance will last indefinitely, regardless of the economic foundation beneath it. And just like Britain, we believe that our currency is invincible, simply because it has been the standard for so long. But history is a graveyard of empires that believed they were the exception to the rule. The Roman denarius, the Spanish real, the Dutch guilder, and the British pound all had their day in the sun. They all collapsed or faded when the nations behind them debased their currency and drowned in debt. The transition from one reserve currency to another is rarely smooth. It is often chaotic, painful, and economically violent. If the United States loses this status, the standard of living for everyday Americans will plummet overnight. Imports will skyrocket. In price, inflation will consume savings, and the ability to borrow cheaply will vanish instantly. This is not a prediction of doom, but a diagnosis of a chronic financial disease that has been left untreated. We are currently in the late stages of the same cycle that brought down the British Empire. The only question remaining is whether we have the political will to change course before the bill comes due. Will we liquidate our bad habits, or will we be forced to liquidate our standing in the world? The clock is ticking, and the timeline is shorter than most politicians or economists are willing to admit. If this analysis has changed how you view history and the current economy, please subscribe for more. I cover the deep economic forces that truly shape our world beyond the daily noise of political headlines. Understanding these cycles is the first step to preparing for the changes that are inevitably coming our way. Let me know in the comments. How long do you think it will be before the US faces its own Suez moment? History does not repeat itself perfectly, but it rhymes, and right now the rhyme is getting louder. Thanks for watching.